Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. 11th of September 2016. Just getting ready to video the outsiders and first dog on the moon, I hope.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy and you're not. And they are Benson Salo. Benson's a financial inclusion advisor at Good Shepherd Microfinance. He is former national director of the National Indigenous Youth Leadership Academy and a former UN Youth Ambassador. So much in one so young, Benson.
A bit busy.
Sinclair Davidson is with you too from the School of Economics at RMIT. As is Seamus Murphy. Now, Seamus is a photojournalist, a war photographer, an exile on an escapee. His current book is The Republic. It takes us back to Ireland, 1916, Seamus, and a remarkable anniversary this year there.
Yes, I just thought it would be a good time to go back and look at modern Ireland 100 years after we wrestled independence.
The Republic thing. Lessons to be learned there. Do you think?
Let's start that one.
Your current audience. Speaking of anniversaries,
today our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Yep, it's 9/11, anniversary thereof. Sinclair, so 15 years back. I mean, could you imagine this world now from then?
No, I don't think so. It's completely different. And in one sense, of course, it feels like just yesterday. And in the other sense, of course, it's dominated our lives. These last 15 years, those horrible attacks. And if you go to New York today and you go and look at the memorials, they're incredibly moving and incredibly well done with the waterfalls going into the holes. It's fantastic. But I think it totally defined George Bush's presidency. I think he would have been a very different president and remembered very differently from what he is now, sort of the warmonger
yes, that's
type thing.
Hard to imagine how that would have played out, because, I mean, everything. He turned and changed in that moment.
He was considered to be almost a moderate. He spoke to everybody. He was well known and well liked by Democrats and Republicans, and a completely different legacy than what he would otherwise have had.
And the world, Benson, since then, it is one, I mean, our experience of it now of a world at war. And in unexpected ways. I mean, today on the news, we've seen news reports of a bloke stabbed in Sydney in what appears to be a terrorist incident, or that someone has been charged in that way. So this war on terror, this thing that started on 9/11 is...
That's right. I actually was 13 when this happened.
I was going to say, you're the youngest one here, right?
Yeah, I actually remember the morning quite well. Jumped out the classroom window and ran to a mate's house and was watching the news for most of the day. And really, we had no idea what kind of impact that this would actually have on all of our lives. And, we've seen young Australian soldiers coming back from the longest war that we've ever been a part of. And we've seen the impacts it's had on geopolitics and the mass migration of immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers throughout Europe. And then we've also seen our reaction as a nation in our kind of defense of our borders and what that has actually done for, I guess, the soul or the heart of our nation.
Which makes you wonder, Seamus, who changed the world most? Is it George Bush or Osama bin Laden? I mean, Osama's legacy is extraordinary.
Yeah, and the war has come home now, hasn't it? Living in London, living in Sydney, living in Melbourne, you just don't know what's going to happen. And this is the legacy, I think, of 9/11.
You have extensive experience of that war as it plays out in Afghanistan, of course, and you were there quite recently.
I was there quite recently. I started going there in '94, and the last one was 2014, so it was 20 years. And, it's had such a roller coaster. When I was going there initially, it was a forgotten war, and no one thought about it. 9/11 happened, and then everyone got engaged. And then Iraq happened, and the focus went somewhere else, and the Taliban came back. And that's, I think, what happened. I think Iraq was huge in terms of what happened in Afghanistan and the war on terror.
Which, again, Sinclair, in terms of the Bush legacy, I mean, this is where there's considerable conversation and division here as to whether the Iraq thing was a ridiculous misadventure.
Yes, I think there's a very clear distinction in people's minds between the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. I wasn't actually totally opposed to the war in Iraq, and I'm still not. I think
Saddam Hussein was a vicious dictator, and if more vicious dictators would die at the end of a rope, that would be a good thing, I think, in the world. So they shouldn't be allowed to get away with it. But I do think, though, that it did distract people from the main game. And there could have been other ways of dealing with Saddam Hussein, but it certainly did sort of metastasize into something much bigger, the war on terror, and of course the terrorists themselves metastasize into something much more dangerous.
I mean, that's a really interesting word for it too, because it's this war which has just grown out into our bodies, is now, you know, in terms of the global human body. It's it's something which is hard to imagine it being under control. I mean, this is something we live with now.
That's right. And when it moves into kind of non-state actors, our former modes of kind of diplomacy, it doesn't actually work. So we look at the UN and its responses, it is actually trying to engage through member states, but the member states themselves, they have very little control over how the non-state actors are actually going to be operating across their borders and influencing, you know, using technology and social media to reach out across borders.
And of course, Seamus, we're lost. You mentioned the forgotten war. I mean, we're lost in something that's almost utterly timeless in Afghanistan. And stories this week of territory which for a period was held by Australian forces at cost of life and obviously expense, but now reclaimed by the Taliban. It's these endless cycles of movement within that country.
Yeah, I think it's America or the West taking their eye off the ball. And then, you know, the reports are often that there wasn't enough equipment for the Afghan National Army, and that's why the Taliban were able to. It's usually about logistics. I mean, war is usually about logistics, the winning or losing of them, or you know, maintaining peace. It's about putting resources into it.
A tremendously difficult thing in that place.
Yes, I guess. I mean, I think it's, you know, it's a country that when the Americans moved in there, they didn't understand the place, and they still don't understand it.
Well, we're at this point on Outsiders going to have a conversation about Sam Dastyari and campaign funding in this country. Benson Sallow with you, Sinclair Davison and James Murphy. We put this man to the vote.
I made all the necessary disclosures, and what I did was within the rules, but it was wrong. I fell short of the duty I owe to the people I'm so proud to represent.
But you voted loud and clear on the text to 0418 226 576 and wanted to hear no more about Sam Dastyari. So we're not going to talk about him. 11 minutes to 10. We are going to talk about, however, an incident, the Brisbane Writers' Festival, just at the end of last week, which I think raised one of the most fascinating sort of conversations of our moment. I mean, what are you free to talk about is basically the conversation. Lionel Shriver giving a keynote address in Brisbane. And she talked about, as a writer of fiction, what are you able to appropriate? What are the limits of your canvas as perhaps a white, privileged writer of fiction in particular? People walked out of that lecture. I wonder, and perhaps Sinclair, you can take the running on this to begin. I mean, is this a symptom of our sort of censorious time?
It is. I think it started off with you can't be rude to people and you can't talk about politics and religion and things like that. And
you can't talk about politics, religion, or sex.
Yes.
Forbidden at the dinner table.
Yes. Well, I wasn't even going to mention sex, Jonathan. But anyway,
your politeness.
Yes. But I think now we're talking about art. And I actually think art is the expression of the human condition, and I think it should be spread far and wide. I just don't think there should be any limits beyond sort of promotion of criminality around what artists can and should do. And I think norms have evolved over time, that we actually allow artists and political cartoonists, let me say, a great deal of latitude to comment on our society and who we are and what we think, and they are actually the legitimate mechanisms whereby we push the limits. So I'm very worried about this sort of censorious nature coming into art form.
Who gets hurt, Benson, when we do push the limits, do you think?
I think there is something that we need to discuss around, I guess, just responsibility to understand the privileged position that we kind of stand in. So having people walk out of that particular lecture, what kind of platform do they have to voice their opinion, and which audience is actually listening? and I think there is that element of responsibility, almost using the lines of Sam Dastiari, where it was within the rules, but
not
but
allowed
wrong.
to mention Sam Dastiari.
But I suppose in this context of, I guess, what is politically correct and what is politically incorrect, what is right and what is wrong, is also the way that we need to think about this, and who has the position to call out what is right and what is wrong.
It's interesting, Seamus, that the person who did walk out famously out of that lecture in the Brisbane Writers' Festival then had access to a column in The Guardian to describe why they did that. So there's almost a clash of privilege there, which in a way sort of sets up this conversation of the warring camps we have currently in public conversation around most points, that we sort of retreat to our corners and almost aren't allowed to intersect.
I wonder, is this some kind of, bulwark against social media? Like, you can't control social media, but if you actually start putting things in position that are taboo, then you can control things. I think it's about control. I think in the end, I think art should be absolutely free. I think it's the expression, as you say, the human condition. It's also the imagination, and if we start putting limits to the imagination, it's very dangerous.
Yeah, the limits are very clear now, and the limits are rigorously enforced, especially in those spaces like social media. I mean, we were talking about this before.
I first heard the expression cultural appropriation with kids not being allowed to wear, say, Indian headdresses at Halloween, and that's or Superman outfits and all this sort of stuff. And I thought this was a bit strange because I have a collection of African art at home. I have a collection of Aboriginal art ties, which are actually quite hard to find, and they're quite expensive as well.
And Davidson's in full confessional mode.
And but I'm not a Black African. I'm not Aboriginal. But at the same time, I'm actually supporting these artists by buying their output, and I'm advertising their ties when I wear them in the streets and to work and what have you. So this is actually a good thing, I would have thought. But
I think the thing here, Benson, correct me if I'm wrong on this. I mean, there are interesting conversations, and there is right and wrong. But we're almost at the point now where the conversation itself is off limits, and to have the conversation is not necessarily to take a side in that conversation.
No, it's the idea of being, I guess, it's being able to dabble and explore ideas and understand different people's perspectives. And as soon as we shut down the conversation, the conversation is lost. The debate is lost, and everyone retreats back to their corner.
I wonder what we're afraid of in that conversation. I mean, why that seems to be the simpler course is just to not talk about it.
I think it's a difficult one, but I think it is people not feeling overly comfortable to actually be able to have the conversation and to be able to debate their ideas and stand by their ideas and debate the idea rather than debate the person.
Which is an interesting thing. I mean, Seamus, if we get to the point where I'm affronted by the very fact that you want to talk about that, then we're not going to resolve much.
Well, I think the problem is that the environment that's been created by people that are object. I mean, people can object, but what they're doing is that they're objecting and they're shutting people down. I think that's what's wrong. I think they should have their say and have their say as loudly as they like, but to be censorious about it and to start sort of controlling things. I think it's about control.
Yeah, it's about control. It's about power too.
Yeah. And they feel, I guess they feel that they don't have control because Lionel Shriver is a best-selling white privileged person, and this person that made the objection doesn't have access to that. But kind of in a way, that's life. Life isn't fair, but you do the best you can.
Okay, I'm going to reserve 5 minutes for First Dog on the Moon just in case it happens. Ciao.